The Puritans were a society of English Protestants who had their heyday in the 16th and 17th centuries. They practically invented the idea of being uptight. As their name implies, Puritan attitudes toward sex were fairly buttoned up. But they came unbuttoned a lot more than you probably thought. So, today we're going undercover to reveal the surprising sex lives of Puritans. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other romantic topics you would like to hear about next. Okay, as Nathaniel Hawthorne probably said, I want your bad romance. Despite their stuffy reputation, you might be surprised to find out that the Puritans weren't anti-sex. In fact, they actually thought sex was pretty great. There are a ton of quotes from prominent Puritans singing the praises of steamy marital intimacy. For example, one wrote that sex should be like two musical instruments rightly fitted that make a most pleasant and sweet harmony in a well-tuned consort. So, like a mixtape. Then there was clergyman William Gouge, who described sex as one of the most proper and essential acts of marriage, and said married couples should go to bed with goodwill and delight, willingly, readily, and cheerfully. And in 1615, Puritan writer Alexander Nichols said that in marriage, thou not only unitest unto thyself a friend and comfort for society, but also a companion for pleasure. So in other words, knock ye boots, and knock ye often. The Puritans not only thought sex should be hot and joyful, they also believed regular slam dunks promoted good health, and that a mutual slam dunk was necessary for conception. Puritan medical texts even recommended good food, wine, a relaxed atmosphere, and foreplay to help married couples synchronize their dunks. We're really nailing this euphemism, pun intended. However, they were Puritans, so they didn't want anyone to have too much fun. For instance, they thought too much sex could cripple you, or shave years off of your life. Sure, but only if it's really good. Of course, the Puritans weren't quite so enthusiastic about all sex. Historical documents from the Plymouth colony show that premarital relations was a major taboo, which could result in harsh punishment. For example, back in 1640, Thomas and Joanne Pinson were busted for doing the deed before being married. Interestingly, we don't exactly know how they got caught, but it's possible Joanna's pregnancy may have shown only a few months after getting married, which would have been a dead giveaway. For their reckless romance, Tom was whipped at the post, while Joanne was made to sit in the stocks. Despite the harsh punishments, premarital hookups were common in Puritan Massachusetts. In Middlesex County, for example, 1 in every 200 births were conceived out of wedlock. Once charged, most such couples just confessed and were then given a choice between being whipped or fined. Men and women were considered equally at fault and were punished similarly for it. However, women were accused of sexual misdeeds more frequently. In fact, the double standard was so bad that there isn't a single case of a married man being accused of adultery in the court records. As historian Anna Newsel of the University of Virginia notes, illicit sexual intercourse, especially by married men, was most certainly a common occurrence. But men were accused of fornication, a less serious offense. The Puritans weren't just sex positive when it came to married couples. They were violently demanding on the subject and would actually discipline men who weren't being intimate with their wives often enough. For example, in 1640, a man named James Maddock was excommunicated from his church in Boston because, among other things, he had denied conjugal fellowship unto his wife for 2 years. James claimed he was taking revenge upon himself for mistreating her before they were married, which is another way of saying he almost certainly had a mistress. And in 1665, one John Williams of Plymouth Colony was hauled into court because he was accused of sequestration of himself from the marriage bed and refusing to perform marriage duty towards his wife Elizabeth according to the law of God and man. John claimed he was actively trying to escape the relationship because Liz was unfaithful, but a jury eventually ruled in her favor, awarding her 1/3 of his estate plus living expenses. Talk about stiff. The Puritans' attitudes towards premarital sex were fairly intense, but in the whole history of the Plymouth colony, only one single person was ever put to death for a sex-related crime. The unlucky fellow was a teenager named Thomas Granger, who was hanged in 1621 after admitting it to doing the deed with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. Sounds like someone needed to invest in a barn door. Granger's fellow Puritans were simply too puritanical to look the other way on this one, so he was whacked, along with every one of his animal companions. And not that anyone would after what happened to Thomas Granger, but you couldn't even joke about something considered so lewd. In at least one recorded case from the Puritan town of New Haven, a couple was run out of town after their dog got frisky with a neighbor's pig, and they cracked a joke. The Puritans would have had tremendous difficulty with some comedies from the 80s and 90s. Birth control methods of the day weren't terribly advanced, but they did exist, usually made from plants or animal intestines. Europeans, for example, used sheep gut condoms, and Iroquois women used birch bark sponges. But the Puritans were opposed to any and all forms of birth control, including coitus interruptus, which, if you don't speak Latin, is just the withdrawal method, the only one that doesn't require a trip to the drugstore. Genesis 38 mentions Onan bailing out, so to speak, and the Lord slew him over the whole thing, so it was pretty dang serious. Consequently, onanism was considered a hideous sin to the Puritans. Long story short, if you were a Puritan, the only form of birth control you could even attempt was to pray before you did the deed. Similarly, any kind of intimate contact beyond vaginal intercourse was considered a crime against God, because none of it can lead to procreation. So all other forms of intimacy were against the law. The Puritans called these laws buggery laws, which comes from the French slang word bourge, meaning heretical. One such form of forbidden intimacy was homosexuality. In fact, being gay was considered worse than adultery, the most abominable, unnatural sin. Despite the intense rhetoric, the Puritans only sentenced a single person to death for homosexuality, and probably because he was also openly atheist. Pretty much everyone got executed for that back then. In general, homosexuality was usually punished by comparatively lighter sentences, such as being burned on the shoulder, getting publicly whipped, or being banished from the colony, although that last one was essentially the same as death. It's not like you could go rent an apartment in the city. However, female homosexuality was only a capital crime from 1655 to 1665 in New Haven. All other Puritan legal codes meant to punish homosexuality by death applied only to men. We're pretty sure we don't want to know why, but in 1645, a strange piece of puritanical legislation outlawed the wearing of visors or masks and strange apparel to lascivious ends and purposes. In other words, you can't trick someone into sleeping with you by wearing a disguise. The legislation explains that some abuses have formerly broken out amongst us by disguising. The whole thing sounds pretty tawdry, but the law must have worked because, as one historian notes, no case of disguises being worn by masked lovers appears in the court records. So wearing disguises was out, but at least you could write the object of your affection a sexy note to entice them into a little something, right? Well, no. Take, for example, the case of Nathaniel Hall, a married man who was accused of using uncivil words and carriages towards Elizabeth Barry in person, and then later giving writings to the said Elizabeth Barry to entice her. We assume Elizabeth Barry was a server at the New Haven Chili's. It's the only case of its kind that we know of, but that didn't help Hall. He ultimately had to choose between a £5 fine or to be publicly whipped. Finally, bundling, or tarrying, was a common practice among the Puritans, and according to at least one expert, it almost certainly promoted unchastity. How did that work? Well, if a young woman's parents approved of her suitor, they would occasionally bundle them by putting them to bed together, the lady with only her underpetticoat on, and her sweetheart with nothing but his breeches. You know, as a treat. Sometimes a bundling board was used to separate the couple. Or in some cases, a sack, as seen in Roland Emmerich's 2000 movie, The Patriot. That's right, something in The Patriot was actually true. According to historian Andrew Gardner, this was a way to see if the couple was sexually compatible in a way that wouldn't upset the Lord. But there was some ground rules. Underclothes must be kept on at all times. Parents would retire to their own bedroom, and there should be no hanky-panky. We're willing to bet a few of those couples found a way to break the rules. So, what do you think? Were the Puritans racier than you thought, or as square as you expected? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.